Well, good afternoon. I assume the slides will come up on the screen momentarily. Um, so thank you everyone again for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon on the session entitled Greening of Coal. I tend to prefer to talk about building a sustainable future for coal because I think that's the direction that we ought to be going in. So I thought I would spend some time talking about the role of coal internationally at the moment, some reflections on India, and also some reflections on what's happening with low emissions coal technologies, which is how we build a sustainable future for coal, and perhaps what we should be doing to continue that. I think it's interesting, first of all, to note that today coal is a critical part of the global energy mix and the global electricity mix. Coal provides about 37% of the world's electricity today. And over the past few decades, it's provided around the high 30s, low 40s of the world's electricity without really changing substantially. So coal is by far the biggest source of electricity we have around the world. It's often described as the backbone of the world's electricity system. Now, the International Energy Agency, in their annual World Energy Outlook, have a new scenario that they've included, which considers the impact of all of the Paris Climate Change Agreement pledges that countries have made, and that's called their New Policies scenario. And in that scenario, they look at the impact on various sources of electricity. And in fact, when you look at what happens with coal, it does go down in terms of a percentage share from 37 today to 26% in 2040. But that's of a much bigger pie of electricity. Global electricity growth will close to double between now and 2040. So even though coal's share will decrease, its absolute contribution to global electricity will actually increase. And of course, we can see on this graph that renewables, when you lump them all together, will come up to about 40% of global electricity. However, the interesting thing about that is if you disaggregate all of those renewables, the vast majority of them are still hydro and biomass, and only a relatively small percentage is wind and solar, the new renewables that are quite popular to be talking about. And so when you disaggregate all of those renewables, coal is actually still the single largest source of electricity in 2040. Even after all of the change and all of the pledges that countries have made in relation to the Paris Agreement, coal will still be the single largest source of electricity in 2040, which I think is an incredibly interesting fact, and one that means we have to look at coal and treat coal very seriously in terms of how we try and achieve global climate objectives. The reason for coal being such a large source of electricity in 2040 is because Asia is really driving new coal generation capacity. You can see in this graph that everything below the black line that runs through it is Asia. So back in sort of 2000, just over a third of the world's coal fleet was in Asia. By today, it's about 2/3 of the world's coal fleet is in Asia. And by 2040, more than 3/4 of the world's coal-fired power stations will actually be in Asia, and that's taking Asia at its broadest definition, so beginning in Pakistan and going all the way through to Japan. So this is a very interesting phenomenon is what's happening with relation to coal, is that it's very much shifting through the developing and emerging economies of Asia. In many places, these plants are still being built at speed today. So one of the other interesting facts that means is that, in fact, the world's coal fleet is actually quite young. It's only about 19 years of age on average for a coal-fired power plant around the world today. Now, coal-fired plants can operate for 40, 50, sometimes even 60 years or longer. So when the average age of the world's coal fleet today is only 19 years, we know that those plants have a considerable amount of time left to operate, and then there are new plants still being built today. So coal is playing a very big role across the Asian economies in particular. It's still playing a role elsewhere as well. Still some coal in the Americas and in Europe and the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So it's not entirely an Asian fuel, but it is very much an Asian story when it comes to the future for coal. And India is a large part of that. Electricity demand growth in India is forecast to be about 4.7% a year over the next 25 years. It's a bit higher than that at the moment, but with this will be taking that growth averaged over the next 25 years. Renewable technologies, and particularly solar, are forecast to grow almost exponentially in India, and that's a huge target to try and achieve. The government is actually doing quite well achieving that target at the moment. But even in the context of that really huge growth in terms of growth for solar in India, coal itself will continue to grow as well. And so we often hear people talk about, well, that because of the huge growth of solar in India, that means we don't need to worry about coal. Well, in fact, coal is growing quite fast in India as well. And in fact, coal generation capacity is forecast to grow by 2.5 times over the next 25 years or so. Now, this is all going to require really significant investment in India's power system, roughly $2 trillion over the next quarter century, according to the International Energy Agency. That's to build up India's energy supply, its electricity supply, to bring electricity to the 200 million or so people that currently don't have access to electricity. But I think most importantly, when it comes to coal, it's to power up the business and industry that can provide real economic growth and provide the jobs and employment for the growing middle-class population that we're seeing emerge in India. Making sure that those people have meaningful work requires affordable and reliable energy for businesses and industries, and I think coal will actually play a very significant role in powering up those businesses and industries, whereas solar perhaps is a little bit less orientated towards the grid and slightly more orientated towards residential consumption. So I think that coal and renewables have a big role to play in India, and we can't forget that it's a story of both, not just one or the other. Globally, we have about 1.1 billion people who have no access to electricity. We often talk about the Paris Agreement on climate change as being one of the major priorities around the world, and it is. But as Sushil Kumar mentioned earlier today, in 2015 we also agreed the Sustainable Development Goals, which is quite a range of goals with lots of targets, and one of those is SDG 7, which is to bring sustainable energy for everyone around the world, and that's to try and make sure that everyone has a connection to electricity. At 1.1 billion people without electricity today, that's a huge challenge to try and deliver electricity to all of those people by 2030, which is the timeline for the Sustainable Development Goals. To my mind, that requires all sorts of different types of electricity. A recent report by the International Energy Agency really did focus on the role that solar can play in providing first grid connections to electricity. So basically remote rural villages in Africa and India and elsewhere, it is easier to build small solar systems that can provide electricity very quickly and actually quite cheaply as well. But this is really what we call very basic level access of electricity. It's where you can access electricity for a few hours a day and just for a few limited purposes, perhaps charging up mobile phones or running floor fans, maybe if you're lucky running a very small fridge on a 24/7 basis. But this is not real access to electricity. This is just a very basic level of access. And so what we think is that we need to have much more ambition when it comes to delivering energy access, and that means much more of a grid-based system, one that can support electricity on a 24/7 basis, that can provide high levels of power going into homes and into businesses and industries and schools and hospitals to really provide the affordable electricity that we need to power up those economies. And we think that coal has an important role to play in doing that. And in fact, when we think about businesses and industries and we look at the story here in Asia, poor electricity supply is in fact the #1 obstacle to growth across developing and emerging Asian economies. The Asian Development Bank did some research recently where they talked to businesses about what are the challenges to growth for you, what are the main challenges to your business. And you can see here things like access to finance, tax, corruption, political instability were all important, but electricity supply was the #1 challenge to growth in businesses across Asia. And if we can't supply affordable and, most importantly, I think, reliable electricity to business and industry, it becomes very difficult for them to power up economic growth and to provide jobs and employment that really provides sustainable long-term growth in an economy. And so I think poor electricity supply is one of the major challenges that we ought to be looking to address. And I'm sure that coal has a role to play in that, particularly in the developing and emerging economies in Asia. One of the other major trends that I think is really interesting and really important globally at the moment is urbanization. Over 6 billion people are expected to live in urban areas by 2050. About 1 billion people are expected to move into cities between now and about 2030. So urbanization offers huge opportunities for improving energy access and supporting sustainable development. Population concentration offers an opportunity to deploy large-scale, low-cost power plants that can support urbanization and modernization, that you can provide reliable grids, grid-based electricity for businesses, hospitals and public services. But one of the other things that's most interesting, I think, really about urbanization is its need for coal-based products. So as the urban population grows, it has a multiplier effect on demand for coal-based products. So it's not just about coal for electricity, it's about coal for making cement and coal for steel making as well. So for every 100 million or so people that you have move into cities, you have an even greater growth in demand for those coal-based products of steel and cement to build the bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, apartment buildings, and so on. And so this is another growth opportunity for coal in the decades to come. And in fact, it's probably where we'll see the biggest growth for coal is in relation to the non-power sector, is in relation to building that urbanizing world with 1 billion people moving into cities over the next couple of decades. But of course, when it comes to power generation, when it comes to coal, power generation is still the biggest story globally, and I think it's something that we need to pay a lot of attention to. What we really need, and I've talked about this before when I've appeared at this conference previously, is to shift towards the low-emission coal technologies, and I'm sure that Dr. Minchiner is going to be talking quite a lot about low-emission coal technologies in his presentation. But I want to explore just for a moment the issue around cost for these technologies. You can see here that when we make a full cost comparison of subcritical technology, the older, less efficient coal plants, versus ultra supercritical plants, that on a lifetime basis, when you add the cost of the capital, the running costs, the operation and maintenance costs, and the fuel costs, the cost of a ultra supercritical plant, a more efficient coal-fired power plant, on a lifetime basis, can actually be cheaper than an older subcritical technology. Now this is something that's really quite important because we have here in India, for example, lots of subcritical plants still operating, but needing to shut those down, looking at shutting those down and building newer, higher efficiency plants that have far lower emissions. But actually we've discovered that because they have far more efficiency, they use less fuel, and therefore their lifetime costs can indeed be less. But they are more expensive from a capital perspective. And so when the cost of that capital increases, what it does is it actually makes the technology choice switch back the other way towards the subcritical plants. Because with an added capital cost for the ultra supercritical plants, that added capital cost just tips the balance back in favor of subcritical from a cost perspective. And so we believe it's very important that we look at how we can make sure that the cost of capital for coal-fired power generation is kept low so that we can encourage a switch to the right kind of technology. And that's why at an international level, the World Coal Association is working very hard to try and encourage the right kind of policies to be put in place to encourage a switch towards the higher efficiency, low emissions plants so that we can get the benefit of reduced emissions, reduced CO2, reduced SOx, NOx particulates that come from burning coal in these plants compared to that older subcritical technology, and also that we can get the affordable fuel from those plants that they actually do provide. And so that's why we want to work with countries to try and encourage them to put in place policy support mechanisms to encourage that shift away from the subcritical technology to the higher efficiency technologies like ultra supercritical coal. But coal does have other benefits as well, and when you're talking about Asia, there's a lot of conversation around the cost of gas and the role of gas. Gas obviously has less CO2 when it's burned at a power station. But one of the most interesting things, particularly in Asia, is that the background infrastructure costs are the thing that really provides a big challenge for gas. And we heard today about a national network for gas in India. But if you look at a 1 gigawatt of power generation from either gas or coal, if you're looking at the background infrastructure cost, what it actually costs to support the plant, it's far more expensive, by about 6 times, in fact, for gas. So by the time you build an LNG conversion facility, the pipelines, all the various things you need along the way for a gas-fired power plant, it costs about 6 times more than the railways, the ports, and things like that that you need for coal. And so this is why across much of Asia, gas hasn't taken off to the degree that you might have expected it to because of the significant background infrastructure costs that are involved. So if a gas plant costs about $1 billion to build for a 1 gigawatt plant, it costs you probably a bit more than that, again, in all of the background infrastructure costs for a gas plant. Whereas it just isn't the case for coal. It costs much, much less. And so this is why I think when we're looking at Southeast Asia and even here in India as well, we've seen much more of a focus on coal because not only are there challenges with gas supply, but the background infrastructure costs that go with gas plants is just very challenging. And so that's why you see in 2015 the figures that the IEA has, the investment in coal versus gas-fired power generation has been about 5-to-1 in favor of coal across the region over in that 2015 year, and it's true for a number of other years as well. So there is much more investment going into coal-fueled power generation across Asia than there is for gas, and I think that points to the fact that we need to focus on the role of coal in the generation across Asia because that degree of investment that's going into it. Encouragingly, it is positive to see that a lot of investment is going into the high efficiency plants compared to subcritical. So that is a shift that's happening in the right direction and one that we certainly do need to accelerate. There are a lot of challenges with deploying low emissions coal technology, but I think that this is a graph that I find interesting and I like to share, and I know there are challenges here about reducing the emissions of like SOx, NOx and particulates in particular in India, but this graph, I think, just shows what can happen when you get the right policy mechanisms in place, the right support mechanisms in place. And this is looking at what's happened in the United States from the 70s through to the early part of this decade, when over that time, huge economic growth in the US, huge growth in consumption of coal, about 140%. Now, you would expect with such huge growth in coal that there would be very significant growth in the SOx, the NOx, the particulates that come from burning coal. Whereas as you can see on this graph, that over the same time, the emissions of those, what they call criteria emissions in the US, was substantially reduced. In fact, in some cases, close to being eliminated. And this is because of the type of regulation and working with industry that has happened in the US. And I think what we ought to be trying to achieve here in India is to look at how we can get industry working together with government to try and address some of these challenges around the non-CO2 emissions that come from burning coal. And we are certainly very much hoping to do some work supporting you with that. Now, cleaner coal technologies are real. They they certainly are operating around the world. In fact, ultra supercritical technology is slowly becoming the technology of choice when it comes to coal-fueled power generation. Starting with the J-Power plant in Asogo, one of the cleanest coal-fueled power plants in the world. China has the Waigaoqiao plant. These are technologies that have achieved very high levels of efficiency and therefore very significant reductions in CO2. But they've also achieved very significant reductions in those technologies, in those emissions like SOx, NOx and particulates. And so these technologies are available, and they're technologies that we ought to be working to share internationally, because we absolutely have to reduce the emissions of CO2 from coal, but we also need to address the challenges around air quality that come from burning coal, not just for public health reasons, but also because of other environmental reasons and because of the need to ensure public acceptance for coal-fueled power. Now, ultimately, if we are going to achieve the world's climate objectives, we do need to see a shift towards carbon capture and utilisation and storage. And we heard both Minister Goyal and Sushil Kumar talk about carbon capture and storage earlier today. This graph gives you a sense as to what the International Energy Agency says is needed when it comes to deploying carbon capture and storage technology as part of a suite of technologies. It's not an either-or choice globally when it comes to addressing climate change. We need all of these technologies. We need renewables, we need fuel switching, we need efficiency, we need more nuclear, but we also need carbon capture and storage. And about 40% of global emissions reductions will need to come from CCS, according to the International Energy Agency. And I think actually from the conversation that I heard this morning and Minister Goyal's presentation, where he talked a little bit about carbon capture, I think we probably do have an opportunity to educate him a little bit more and actually let him know what is happening internationally on CCS, because there is actually quite a lot happening on CCS internationally. There's about 20 or so large-scale CCS plants operating around the world today. Not all of them are on power generation. In fact, only 2 are on power generation in coal, and both of those at large scale are in North America. But they are operating successfully, and this is the important thing, is to know that carbon capture and storage is technically feasible. And it is now just a matter about bringing down the costs and getting the right policy mechanisms in place to support it. And that's where the utilisation aspect comes in. So most of the plants that are operating with CCS around the world today are in fact using that CO2. And this is, I think, an important opportunity for CCS, is actually to get a revenue stream for that carbon, find something to do with it. And so I think it's encouraging that there is work going on here in India to even look at how we can utilise carbon to bring down the costs of that carbon capture. In fact, there's a very interesting plant that's operating in southeastern India, I think it is, in Tuticorin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is operated by a company called Carbon Clean Solutions. Now, this is an unsubsidised and fully commercial carbon capture and utilisation project where just on a small 10 megawatt kiln for coal kiln for cement making, they're capturing the CO2 at a very low cost and then using that CO2 for making soda ash, which is for glass making. And so this is very exciting technology because, number one, it's being done at a very low cost. It's being done on a completely commercial and unsubsidized basis, and it's being put to productive use. And that's happening here in India, which I think is incredibly exciting, and certainly something that we would like to encourage some more of, because that sort of innovation taking place in a country like India is incredibly important, given the role that coal is expected to have here over the next few decades at the very least. But we don't have the right kind of policy mechanisms so far put in place to support carbon capture, and whether we utilize it or store it, we need to do much more in that space. And because we don't have the right kind of incentives and the right kind of policy mechanisms put in place, we're not seeing the investment. So over the past decade or so, all total investment in clean energy technology has amounted to about $2,500 billion, whereas for carbon capture and storage, it's been about $20 billion. So it's almost impossible to compare. And the reason for that is because the policy settings aren't in place. The governments haven't yet given the right signals to say, we want to pursue carbon capture and storage. Lots of signals have gone in place to indicate support for renewables technology, and in fact globally over the past 10 years or so there's been about $800 billion worth of subsidies put in place for renewables technologies. Governments haven't been putting in place the same kind of policy support, policy mechanisms to encourage the deployment of carbon capture and storage. And I think that's something that, now that we can try and educate Minister Goyal more about what's happening on CCS globally, he can see hopefully that there will be opportunities for CCS, CCUS here in India. And in fact, I heard Anil Razdan earlier talking about the coal cess here in India, and that not being put to good use at the moment. And perhaps what we do need to do is see the coal cess, the revenue coming from the coal cess being deployed towards low emission coal technology so that India can benefit long term from the very substantial coal resource that you have, but do it in a way that is environmentally sound and sustainable in the longer term. And so perhaps we ought to be seeing some of that coal cess money going back into cleaner coal technologies so that we can get the benefit of those in the future. Now, India is not alone when it comes to using coal and actually to being focused on the role of low emissions coal technologies around the world. So we've talked a couple of times about the Paris Agreement, and many people said to me when the Paris Agreement was signed, oh, isn't this the end of coal? And I was actually quite happy to say, well, no, it's not, because the foundation of the Paris Agreement is actually the intended nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, the commitments and pledges that countries made in the lead up to those negotiations. And there are now 24 countries around the world who have included a role for low emissions coal technologies as part of their Paris Agreement commitments. So that means countries like India, China, Japan, and many others that you can see on the map there have said coal is going to be an important part of our power generation mix in the decades to come. And so we want to focus on the role of low emission coal technologies in trying to achieve our climate objectives. And so there is quite a strong alliance internationally of countries in theory who are already using low emissions coal technologies and those who want to progress to do that further. We think that there ought to be more cooperation between these countries that are very keen to use coal and want to develop low emissions coal technologies further, use them to achieve both their energy access and their economic development objectives, but also to achieve their climate objectives. These countries ought to be working together, and so I would certainly encourage India, along with countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, to be cooperating on the deployment of low emission coal technologies because they will be so critical across the region in particular. Now, at the most recent COP in Bonn, just late last year, there was announced an organization called the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Not everyone likes coal internationally, it might surprise you to know. But it's very interesting to see that this Powering Past Coal Alliance actually only represents countries that use currently just under 2% of global coal consumption. So these are countries who say that they're moving away from coal, but actually they very much don't use coal as it is today. Whereas those 24 countries that have included a role for coal in their Paris Agreement pledges are countries like China, India, and indeed many other countries around the world. So they are very much focused on their low emissions coal technologies. So when we see people talking about powering past coal, we have to realize where they're coming from, and it's normally sets of countries that don't use coal very much at all today. So that brings to an end my presentation, and I'd like to thank you all very much for paying attention, and I'm sure we'll have some questions later.